Let's go, girls.
So, the RCR. The first thing that we're going to talk about here is usually in a way that I would have questions about this optic in particular. The first one being essentially holster fitment. It's not terribly special as far as being a closed emitter optic and being fairly large, but as far as holster fitment and that sort of stuff is concerned, I would start to examine certain things. In this particular case, as far as a gun belt is concerned, I use a Safariland 6354DO, and it fits 110% inside of that because this holster is made for large optics like the Acro, which seems to be the larger of the bunch. And as far as concealed holsters are concerned, well, we're not too terribly worried about holster fitting issues for things like that because there's nothing really covering a optic of any sort as far as most are concerned. Point is that as far as holster fitment is concerned, there are no real issues here, especially if you have a holster that accommodates larger optics. Now, if you have a holster that accommodates smaller optics, you may run into an issue, but this is essentially where you start doing a little bit of your homework here to see if it'll fit. The next question that I have are the screws. It's the next question that everyone has. It's the screws. How do they install? Do they install well? What's the deal? So first and foremost, this is designed to be applied to anything that has a standard RMR footprint. I say standard because there are some non-standard RMR footprint cuts and plates and whatnot that exist. So essentially anything that has a non-standard fitting arrangement for these things, for instance, if you have posts sticking out of the top end of your slide, or if your particular mounting methods from, for instance, Zev or Langdon are using different thread pitch screws, this is very likely not going to work because it's designed to be used with the thread pitch screws that come with a standard, for instance, Type 2 RMR. So if your slide cut or whatever is made for that specifically, which you will have to look up a little bit, you're in good shape. Essentially, if you're taking stock standard RMR screws, you're good to go. Now, I don't really have a problem with this, mostly because the screws themselves, as far as thread pitch and that sort of stuff, have tolerances to where I've installed RMR Type 2s to slides before without Loctite, and so long as you're following correct torque spec, I haven't actually had them come loose. So these being essentially the same thread pitch as that is great, and as far as tolerances for those threads, we're good to go here as well because I haven't had anything loosen up. Now, this particular optic uses a capstan screw, which is frankly brilliant, and not a lot of people understand why. So you see a lot of different reviews of a lot of people concerned about torque specs and not being able to use torque wrenches. The thing is that they provide you a torque spec and they actually provide you a card for it as well. Now, a lot of people like to sit here and pretend like all of us are dumber than goldfish and that it's impossible to understand something as simple as an angle of nut method on how to exactly torque something visually. Now, anyone that's worked on cars has heard something like, hey, torque to X number of foot-pounds and then give it a half turn. It's really similar with this as well. And the thing is that a lot of people also don't understand that the Allen key that is supplied with the optic helps out in quite a few ways as far as properly installing the thing. One, because it will bend according to their spec, so once you have things tightened up and then you start to actually torque it in there with essentially a pry bar, which is what they've provided, it's supposed to bend a certain number of lines on this card before you break something. So what you probably shouldn't use is an Allen key or something that is significantly stiffer if you're trying to torque these capstan screws into place. This is brilliant, at least to me, because it's now very, very difficult to strip or snap anything as far as these screws are concerned. Now, if you try, and you shouldn't try, you could probably severely over-tighten the screws. But as long as you follow the directions, and I did, and applied like a single dot of blue Loctite to these screws, nothing is going to happen to you. Also, just because of the nature of how the screws install to the optic body, it's pretty easy to install some witness marks so that nothing really gets screwed up over time. Now, as far as installing screws with Torx bits or whatever, was it really that big of a deal before? No, but anyone that units, strip screws, or anything like that before can look at this and be like, oh, that's actually quite brilliant, because you can get the proper torque spec with a visual indicator on that torque versus having to rely on a torque wrench, whether or not you've got one. And because of the design of the capstan screws, it's pretty hard to break things, which is why I personally really appreciate it. Now, is it anything other than a little bit of a quality of life boost? No, not really, but it's a quality of life boost, at least in my eyes. And some people like to create issues and say that these are a pain to install, and honestly, you can just kind of tell that these people haven't really worked wrenches in their lives, because it's not, and it's actually really cool to provide a way to make it hard for me to break things. Personal opinion, sure, but let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about this optic body now. The optic body itself, whether or not we realize it, actually retains a lot of the U shape that the Type 2 RMR has. And whether or not people realize it, that is one of the biggest reasons as to why it is so resistant to damage. Now, of course, inside of this little U shape, there's a battery compartment and that sort of thing, but at the same time, they've also upgraded their electronics, but we'll get to that here in just a bit. Cool little quality of life boost as well. The very edges of this U shape have been dehorned a little bit, which is actually quite nice, because I carry appendix, and while I'm carrying an optic appendix, it's kind of nice to not have stuff poking at me. Now, was a Type 2 RMR terribly uncomfortable to carry before? No, but again, it's kind of nice to have a little bit of a quality of life boost, even if I didn't even know that I wanted it. Because all this really feels like to me is that there's a little box sitting against my body, and I don't even really notice anything further from that. Speaking of the optic body, it's not overly large either, given the window size. Now, the cool thing about this is that the window size is a little bit larger than that of, for instance, an Acro P2 without being overly large. It would seem that they did their very best to try and slim it down as much as they could while also providing the closed emitter in the first place. So again, good deal. The next thing that I personally had a question on, and many other people do as well, is those buttons look friggin' huge. Is it easy to accidentally press the buttons on? Now, the cool part about these is that you can tell that these buttons were designed to be actuated with gloves on in the dark, and probably on a rifle too, but it's not like this is terribly different for a handgun either, because it's easy to find the plus or minus key on the optic body itself, and only the plus or minus key actually actuate anything as far as increasing or decreasing brightness. So while the pad is large, finding the plus or minus key is really easy, and not like the Type 2 RMR was really difficult to adjust as far as brightness is concerned, but it's a little squishy, and with the RCR, it's quite easy and tactile feeling to increase or decrease. I can actually tell if I'm pressing the button versus sort of supposing whether or not I am. Now, as far as the optic body is concerned, there is one tiny little inconvenience that I have with it personally, and that's during the zeroing process. Now, if your rear iron sight is in front of your optic, there isn't much really to talk about here, because there isn't anything really in the way. But if your rear iron sight is behind the optic, it sort of shoves the elevation adjustments in this tiny little hole that you can't really get to with a lot of things. It sort of makes you find that specific flathead or similar tool to go inside of that place and make the adjustments. So I can't adjust it with the rear of a case on, for instance, my 34. Is this a big deal? No, it's just a minor inconvenience, which is why I said it's a slight inconvenience. Now, of course, I've seen this in comment sections and stuff before, and I've actually seen other reviewers talk about this too, which makes no sense to me, but there is a question as to whether or not it prints because the optic is rather large, and no, it doesn't, because it's sitting more towards your center line while you're carrying appendix in the first place. Generally speaking, the only thing that really prints off of guns in the first place is the pistol grip itself, most likely around the magazine well, which makes sense. Whether or not this optic prints more doesn't make any sense at all, and of course it doesn't. Moving up top, we're going to talk about this battery compartment a little bit too. Now, what's great and what doesn't cause me any concerns, like for instance a 507 comp or a 509T, is that when you actually remove the battery compartment to install a battery, you can see a very well done, really redundant, frankly, and kind of hard to screw up seal, which keeps any moisture invasion issues or anything like that away from the optic. Anybody that understands how a lot of moisture seals work, especially for battery compartments, will look at this and be rather impressed at the fact that it's like, wow, it's actually kind of huge considering what it is. But of course, Trijicon is actually pretty good at putting a lot of redundancy into what it is that they're doing. Speaking of which, in the 2032 battery compartment, which I also like quite a bit, that we use a 2032 battery in the first place, but in this battery compartment, you can see the enormous contacts. They seem to have upgraded even further from the Type 2 RMR contacts, which is frankly awesome, okay, because anything that prevents any sort of contact loss with my battery is something that I'm all the way for on this 2032 battery as well. Look, I realized actually that over time, I've actually made assumptions and inadvertent excuses for HoloSun optics and how fast their batteries actually die. Now, either I'm using a circle-only dot on an old 507, or I'm using the ACSS reticle in the ACSS Vulcan, or it's the 509T, or it's the ACSS version of the 509, or it's the 507 comp because I'm using a little horseshoe in there. Every single time I would say something like, well, I'm using a larger reticle, so it has to be demanding more power. And what's interesting to me is the batteries that they use are actually smaller, and then they used a shake-awake feature. But I'm regularly using these optics, and even still, even with that shake-awake feature, I've noticed that I'm changing batteries right at or just a little bit more than 4 to 5 months at a time. So I started calling out, and I started asking guys that I know train a lot, especially guys in my student base, like, hey, how often in your HoloSun optics do you change your batteries? And nearly every time, these guys were saying exactly the same thing, around about 4 or 5-ish months, but I've changed my batteries a bunch over the years. What's interesting to me is that as far as Type 2 RMRs and 2032 batteries and that sort of stuff, is that I don't actually recall changing a Type 2 RMR battery because it was dead. Generally speaking, actually exclusively speaking, I've changed these batteries on a once-a-year cycle. The fact that this retains that large battery just tells me that it's retaining the same form factor as the Type 2 RMR. Now, I haven't had this optic that long, but what I will say is I see the improved contacts, I see the great seal, and I see the larger battery in here. I don't think I'll run into anything as far as having to change batteries. And what's even more so a noteworthy thing as far as batteries and battery life are concerned is when I'm starting to develop as far as theories are concerned, because I've actually changed my battery in my 507 comp already as well, is I don't think that the shake-awake feature is actually a feature. I think that it's required to get you to that point in the first place, because everyone that I've called that regularly uses their guns never gets to the 1-year mark as far as HoloSun optics are concerned. So the fact that we're using a 2032 and an RCR here is pretty big ups as far as I'm concerned. Alright, so now let's talk about something that frankly irritates me a lot, and let's talk about the window or the glass size or whatever, right? I hate this subject, and I really hate this subject because of the fact that I have seen a lot of people claim basically incredibly inaccurate information on this. And here's what I mean. If you start searching through YouTube and that sort of stuff, you'll hear other people talking about how the window size is larger than that of an RMR. And having stood up one next to the other, and then looking at comparisons in window size between the RCR, the RMR HD, and the Type 2 RMR, what I've noticed is, yeah, the RCR is larger than an Acro's window, but basically everything is. Realistically speaking, and this is something else that irritates me, I don't really think that the RMR's window is that small. A lot of people talk about having to shoot through a tunnel, a lot of people talk about how small that window really is, and I just don't think that a lot of people realize that the optic itself sits pretty low, and the window size between the Type 2 RMR, the RCR, and the RMR HD are all very similar, with minor differences in hood size and dimensions, but overall, they're very similarly sized. The only time that you start to see a real window size difference between one and the other is when you start talking about the 507 comp or the SRO. So why do people say these things? And I think it's just because they've overlooked something that's fairly important and honestly a pretty cool quality of life difference between the Type 2 RMR, the RCR, and the RMR HD, because a lot of people say that the latter two examples I've mentioned have larger windows. And all this really is, and this is what I believe it to be, is that the optic deck for both of these is slightly taller. A lot of people have noticed that the RMR HD more prominently is raised and slightly cantilevered forward, and the RCR stands up fairly tall. That's only because the similarly sized window just gets a little bit higher and clears the irons a little bit better so that it's easier to see without the irons in the way. That's all it is. I don't understand what these reviewers are talking about as far as large window size. It doesn't make any sense because they're not that different. If you were to really compare the sizes of these windows next to each other, the Type 2 RMR next to the RCR, the RMR Type 2 window is actually a little bit wider as far as the left and right window is concerned, and the RCR is a little bit overall taller, which is magnified even more by the fact that the optic sits a little bit taller when it's actually mounted to a handgun. So that doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't understand how people with eyes could overlook this. And the reality of the matter for all of it is the window size is perfectly adequate if you know how to use a dotted pistol in the first place. If you have solid technique, good training, been trained or whatever, you're not gonna lose the dot in the glass. And the only reason why large windows are big advantages in the first place is because they give you larger margin for error on presentation of the gun, or if you're in a position that can compromise whether or not the gun shoots flat. So if you're in a really weird position, or if you're shooting one-handed in some cases, yeah, it could compromise your ability to track the dot consistently because the handgun is recoiling irregularly. But as far as two-handed shooting is concerned, the size of these windows between them and like an SRO or a 507 comp is basically non-existent. The real advantage, as previously stated, comes up when you draw the handgun or finish a reload or do a sprint stop and bring the gun back up in front of your face really fast. That's where the real advantage is here. That said, the fact that the RCR does stand up a little bit taller than an RMR Type 2 in the first place actually does help out a lot, because if you're putting this into an RMR footprint that was previously cut for a Type 2, it's going to stand up a little bit taller than your irons are in the first place, which allows you a little more visibility and a little bit less iron sight clouding or getting in the way of or obstructing your view or detection of the dot in the first place. And the reality of the matter is this: everything I just said about the Type 2 RMR, the HD, and the RCR, all of these windows are perfectly adequate for the vast majority of things that most people are going to deal with in the first place. The only time that this will actually cost you or has real limitations is when you are dealing with a competitive environment against peers that are highly trained, where the smallest fractions of seconds can separate you from a podium or not placing anywhere near close to the top 10. And this might be a difficult take for some to hear, but as far as self-defense scenarios in a parking lot of a Waffle House someplace, or dealing with Hadid in the Middle East someplace else, realistically speaking, your chances of taking on one of those guys and it being a stiffer challenge, assuming you're well trained or that you train or whatever, but your chances of taking on one of those guys and it being a stiffer challenge than Grandmaster pick a name in a competition that you're trying to defeat is extremely low. But as far as the optic size for presentation of the gun on target, getting it where you need to get it and that sort of thing, it's perfectly adequate for the vast majority of things, especially if you're outside a lot. And let's talk about that here for a second. So the front glass is recessed quite a bit away from the optic body itself, and that does help out quite a bit, especially when you compare it to, again, the Type 2 RMR, because this is a little bit of a quality of life boost in that because it's recessed quite a little bit away from the optic body itself, your chances of brass nicking your glass are significantly reduced. Now, I'm not saying they're eliminated, because brass, especially if you have iron sights mounted to the rear of your handgun like I do for my 34, while your chances of brass nicking your glass are still inevitable, it is still reduced, and the optic body itself is going to take a lot of those nicks instead of the glass. Again, not a huge deal, because you should be target focused in the first place, but it is a little bit more helpful when it's raining a whole lot and when those little nicks in the glass start getting reflected a little bit by the emitter that's projecting a reticle on screen. Again, is this a big issue? No, it's absolutely not. It's just a little bit of a quality of life boost. Another little quality of life boost is the rear glass is flush with the optic body itself. Now, what this prevents is the ability for just things to pool or collect on the rear glass. That's a big thing that you can run into with open emitter optics. And I'm not talking about being absolutely jammed up with snow or mud or whatever. I'm just saying that if it's raining a whole lot, it's significantly easier for a whole swimming pool to collect in your optic. Now, there are drain holes, right? So you're not just shooting through the fishbowl, but it's not like that water goes all the way away anyway. So while you can deal with it, and while we've been dealing with it forever, it is just kind of nice to not have to deal with that at all. And if you get things like snow that's starting to pile up on, for instance, my rear sight, and the gun gets presented, I can still see the dot because nothing was allowed to be collected there. And by the time the first shot fires, everything is cleared and we're good to go. As far as rainwater and that sort of stuff, I've never had enough actually collect on that screen to provide any sort of problem at all. And as far as damaging the glass is concerned, your rear glass is significantly less likely to deal with nicks and scratches and that sort of thing, because what's most often going to damage or nick or scratch that glass is coming from brass leaving your action in the first place. So I view this personally as a significant quality of life increase, because there's nothing that's allowed to collect in that space and create any problems. Now, because it's a reflex sight and because there's a dot projected on screen, I do got to talk about parallax a little bit, and it seems to be virtually identical to the Type 2 RMR. So is that great? It's never really been great, and most pistol optics are pretty bad as far as parallax is concerned, but it's something that you can work with. And if there's no change in that, then I can't really count it as a negative, honestly. There is a notch filter present, although it seems to be slightly less than that of a Type 2 RMR, which is what it's trying to upgrade over. So, okay, neat. And I personally like notch filters anyway. They help preserve battery life, and they only really come into play as far as a problem, air quotes, when I'm doing a bunch of vision shooting and that sort of thing. But that's only really an issue if I'm trying to passive shoot with a rifle at greater distances. As far as handguns go, they don't really cause any problems as far as contrast and that sort of thing, and I can bring the dot up and use it well. Speaking of bringing the dot up and using it well, the Type 2 RMR dot was never really an issue as far as the 3 1/4 dot was concerned, but I will say that it wasn't the clearest dot ever, and for the longest time I actually preferred the 6-minute dot and just dim it down a little bit more because it was a little bit cleaner. And the only reason why I cared about it being cleaner was if I was going to use it passively under night, because especially well-used Type 2 RMRs sometimes would turn really starbursty, or in some cases pretty squiggly, and if it's not as clearly defined as far as dots are concerned, and then you have a whole bunch of sparks and unburnt powder lighting up and that sort of stuff in front of your face, your chances of losing the dot are significantly increased, because this isn't clean to start, so I gotta dim it down some so that I can contrast it off of things that I'm trying to punch holes in or whatever, and because it's dimmed down and I'm dealing with little squiggly lines or really weird starbursty shapes, they can get lost in the sparks. Because this dot is significantly cleaner, which more or less is an indication of an electronics package upgrade, I don't have those issues at all. And as you see in the footage, I've shot this thing at night, either through white light or under vision. So again, quality of life improvements across the board so far. While speaking of this, the brightness, even with the notch filter slightly reduced, gets plenty bright, way brighter than I would ever need for most situations. So if I'm in an environment that has like bleached white sand in the desert someplace, I'm definitely going to see this thing adequately. Speaking of the sunlight, with the Type 2 RMR or even the SRO, if the sunlight hits just right, it reflects weird off of the open emitter, and it will create a little weird shoebox or rectangle of red reflected light around the dot that I'm trying to use. Now, if I'm staying target focused on that sort of stuff, is there a workaround that I can use adequately? Absolutely. It's called staying target focused and not getting distracted, although sometimes it can be rather distracting depending on time of day and how hard that little red box hits. With the RCR, I don't see this at all, and I've tried to find it in broad daylight under direct sunlight, which kind of sucks to try and look for, but regardless of angle or whatever that I would try to pick up, I would not get this little faint box reproduced around my dot. Yet again, another little quality of life boost. And as far as its overall hardiness is concerned, meaning can it endure things in the same way that the Type 2 RMR can, I personally don't do torture tests, I don't do drop tests. There are other people whose lane that is, there are other people who have done that plenty. My job in this regard was to extract details from shooting it a whole bunch, which is why I shot just over 5,500 rounds through this in a very short period. The firing schedules are quite high. I've had this thing since late January, and here we are in early March. So I've put on quite a few rounds quite quickly on this individual optic, and as far as all of that is concerned, I have not lost anything remotely close to zero. These capstan screws did not even approach coming loose, and I checked on it on a regular basis to make sure that everything was tight. I'm sitting there wiggling optics, and I'm paying attention to where the little screw holes are to make sure that we're not moving all over the place, and to make sure that we're retaining zero. And I probably would have noticed as well, because especially under a lot of the footage I've been collecting with regards to the TAO2 review that I plan on doing, there are some times where I've had to place a couple of fairly long handgun shots, more or less out of impulse, so 60 plus yards, and yeah, absolutely, I've just kind of messed around and tried to fire my handgun at 100 yards, and the thing is that I have had nothing close to any sort of reliability issue or zero loss or screws coming loose or anything like that at all. So here's the $775 question. I have done nothing but sing this thing's praises since this review started, and realistically speaking, a lot of you are going to have questions in your mind over whether or not you actually need this optic, especially considering that over time we've noticed that open emitter optics have enough workarounds, and if you are well practiced at shooting a whole bunch, there's plenty of things that you can do to basically just make everything work without too many issues that would prevent you from doing, well, anything. And the first thing that I could say about this, and again, answering the $775 question, is do you need this? If you're a competitor and you're trophy hunting and that's your lot in life and all you want is to compete, which there is nothing wrong with at all. No, obviously not. There are better options in the first place. The 507 comp and the SRO have essentially cornered the market on slide-mounted optics that will do the job really well, consistently, and give you the performance edges that you're looking for. As far as individual self-defense and guys that own Type 2 RMRs or similar optics and that sort of stuff, that if it's not a Trijicon RMR HD or a Type 2 RMR, in a lot of cases can be half the price of this thing. I mean, for Christ's sake, the 507 comp is basically half the price of this, because they can be had for just about $400 once they're shipped. Realistically speaking, and I gotta be honest here, you don't actually need this optic. What I will say though, and one of the reasons why I'm singing its praises so hard, is that over time, especially if you train a lot, and these are guys that shoot roughly or over 10,000 rounds a year, so guys that are pretty dedicated to the training part of this, you'll eventually want one of these. And the reason why you'll want one of these over time is I personally value convenience. I personally value just not having to look at my optics ever, to just know that the thing is gonna turn on, stay on, and I don't have to worry about anything. I value simplicity in that way, and I value not just hardiness, but all of the little quality of life improvements that this thing has more or less decided to present as a package that people will want to buy. All of the little things that this does stacks itself up into a package that I personally like, to the point where, again, the original plan was once I shot this a whole bunch on a pistol, I was going to mount it to a TAO2 and call that a completed package. But now I'm just going to buy two. And the main reason for this is that I don't have to deal with rainwater or cleaning stuff out of the backside of my glass. I don't have to deal with slightly less clean projection of dot when I'm shooting passive under night vision. I don't have to worry about whether or not the battery is going to last past 4 or 5 months, because I'm just going to be straight. I just haven't had a Holosun with the smaller batteries like the 1632 that has actually lasted past that point. I just don't have to deal with any of that stuff. I can just put it on a gun and roll with it, and frankly, that convenience is enough to push me over the edge on it. And none of this comes out of necessity or strict need, because I have optics that work. I just personally very much value the convenience of it all, and the fact that, again, convenient, my guns are cut for standard RMR thread pitch in the first place. So why would I have a problem with any of this? You see what I mean? So is this optic for everybody? I hope I have more or less outlined very clearly that no, it's not, but for those that value the things that I do in the same way that I do, that's enough for you. For guys that have listened to this whole thing, first of all, at this point, thank you very much, but then have come to the conclusion at the end that I just like my dots and they'll serve me just fine. Dude, I totally get it. But at the end of the day, I've got this guy mounted to a handgun. I was gonna move it someplace else, but when able, I'm just gonna buy a new RCR and mount that to my TAO2 package and call that a completed gun, because I don't really foresee this moving off of my 34. It lives in a pretty good spot here. And of course, yes, I'm gonna test other stuff and optics are gonna move and that sort of thing, but if my reviewing career stopped right now, I would have no problems with not buying another red dot for the foreseeable future. And again, I'm not even saying that it's the best performing optic ever. I said in the past that the 507 comp is the best performing dot I have used on a handgun ever. And that's still true. The window size is enormous. It's still on the same footprint as an RCR, and I personally really do like the circle only reticle in it because it makes sure that the portion of my brain that wants to occasionally focus on the dot just doesn't, because there isn't a dot to focus on. But hopefully, after all of these ramblings and going through all of these feature sets and all of this stuff, you can more or less come to a decent conclusion after being fed enough information from someone that's actually used the friggin' thing. After everything is said and done though, realistically speaking, yes, the RMR HD exists, but at the same time, the biggest thing that the RCR actually is it's every single thing we've asked for after we got some time to use the Type 2 RMR. Cleaner dot, good battery life, closed emitter, harder to trap things inside of it, top loading battery so I don't have to dismount it in order to change batteries out once a year. It is literally everything that we wanted in the package that we asked for, and that's the biggest reason why I like it as much as I do. So that being said, guys, if you want to come out and train with us, you absolutely can. Schedule's been posted, more than one class is sold out, but there's still a lot of them available to include our vehicle class, a lot of different places that we want to go to as far as handgun and rifle sets. If you want to set up a private class with us, you absolutely can. If you want to support us through Patreon, you can absolutely do that as well. And if you want to get something out of that, $41 a month gets you as much open enrollment training as you want with us, unless it's a logistically taxing class, like for instance that soft skin vehicle class or a private class for fairly obvious reasons. If you want to check us out to our other social media links, you can absolutely do that. And also, I opened up a Discord recently, so if you want to check that out, links for all of this are in the description below. And remember, guys, a regular guy's firearm is the last defense against tyranny. Be easy.